Hey there, everyone. I'm meteorologist Hannah Fink, and for next weather, we will be talking about tropical systems that have formed in the month of May. We are now officially a month out from the official start of hurricane season, which is on June 1st. Now, it is not really common to see tropical systems form during the month of May. There's a lot that goes into it, especially now the chances of that are very low because we're in an El Nino pattern. If you're curious about what that entails, we have plenty of explainers in next weather on the El Nino pattern from myself and meteorologist Matt Barentine. So if you're curious about that, you can go into that deep dive there. But this is just to give you an idea of what we look at going into hurricane season, right before hurricane season, and also this is a good way to make you more aware of things we look at when we are forecasting during the tropical season. So we're going to get right into it. I'm going to use visualizations from the historical hurricane tracks using Mobile County as the center point for the location, and we're going to go from a more broad picture and slowly go in a little bit there. So let's get right into it. One thing that I do find is important for all of us to understand is this is a transition period in the atmosphere. We're not fully into the traditional hurricane season pattern just yet, and that plays a huge role in what we could see during the month of May. The first thing to look at is where these early season systems tend to form. In May, most tropical or subtropical systems develop in the Western Caribbean Sea, the Southern Gulf, or occasionally just off the Southeast U.S. coastline. These areas warm up a lot faster than the open Atlantic, so if a storm is going to find enough heat energy to get going, it's usually going to be in one of these regions. So the broader Atlantic, where you can see there's not much really there, especially the deep tropics where we see Cape Verde systems later in the season, is still too stable and not quite warm enough yet to support development. But even these favored areas, development is still relatively uncommon, and as you can see, there's not a lot there. This is the month of May. This is quite a broad location. Yes, there are storms there, but there are not a lot. So when you look at May climatology, you'll notice something right away. There are very few hurricanes. In fact, most years have had none at all, and in the rare case that a hurricane does form in May, it's usually very short-lived. The environment just doesn't support long-duration strengthening. So as you can see on the map here, I'm going to pull up the legend to give you a better idea. Green and blue are kind of those tropical systems. Blue is tropical depressions, green is tropical storms, and then there is a little bit of yellow, which is Category 1 storms. They were very weak, and they were a little bit on the more long-lived side, but it also just depends on how fast-moving the storm was. They can look long-lived, but overall, not something we typically see a lot. And then there are a few grays in there, which is extratropical storms or systems. So a big reason for this, why we don't see much development, is wind shear. You're going to hear us talking about that a lot going into hurricane season or just in explainers like this. So during May, the upper level winds across the Gulf and Caribbean are often still quite strong. That means at different levels, there's different wind directions fighting one another. So that usually is a killer to anything tropical. That shear essentially tilts a developing system and prevents it from stacking vertically, which is critical for intensification. Even if you have warm waters at the surface, if the storm is getting torn apart aloft, it simply cannot organize efficiently. So another thing we look at is the jet stream. That's usually one of our biggest drivers for weather, to give you an idea of what that is. This is still fairly active during this time of year. That's why we have our severe weather seasons the time that we do. It often dips down into the Gulf Coast region, dragging cold fronts further south than we would typically see in the peak of summer. Those fronts bring cooler, drier air and create a more hostile environment for tropical systems. At the same time, they can actually help spark development by leaving behind stalled boundaries over warm water, but those systems tend to be messy and, again, very short-lived. That's why many May systems aren't purely tropical. They often have subtropical characteristics, meaning they're partially driven by temperature contrast in the atmosphere rather than just warm ocean waters. These storms can look different on satellite. They can be broader in structure, and their strongest winds are often located further from the center. A recent example that fits into this pattern is Tropical Storm Arlene in 2023, which as of now is the most recent named storm to form during the month of May. So I'm going to pull that up here. The way we discovered this is I did 200 nautical miles from Mobile to get that track there. So we have that here in the track for 2023 as a tropical storm. So we're going to use that as an example first. So a recent example that fits into this pattern is Tropical Storm Arlene in 2023, which as of now is the most recent named system to form during the month of May. Arlene developed in the Gulf and never had much time or support to strengthen. It was a short-lived system that struggled against shear and dry air, which is exactly what we typically expect this time of year. It serves as a good reminder that while development is possible, the environment is usually working against these storms from the start. So what does a typical May pattern look like across the Gulf Coast? Well, it's usually dominated by frequent cold fronts that are still pushing through the region. These cold fronts don't just bring shifts in temperature, they are also bringing instability, wind shifts, and varying moisture levels. Behind them, you often get pockets of dry air filtering in from the continental United States. Ahead of them, you can get warm, humid air surging northward from the Gulf. This constant battle in the atmosphere creates a setup that is inconsistent at best for tropical development. Sea surface temperatures might be warm enough in some spots, especially in the southern Gulf, but the atmosphere above is often not cooperative. You need both of these things to have any sort of strengthening or intensification for these storms. If they're not working together and they're working separate, then we're not really going to have much favorability for long-lived development. You may briefly get a window, though, where shear relaxes and moisture increases, but those windows tend to be short, which is why we typically see these short-lived storms. And that's really the key to understanding why storms do occasionally form in May. It's all about those brief alignments of favorable conditions. Typically, it starts from a stalled frontal boundary over warm waters. That boundary can act as a focus for low pressure to develop. If wind shear temporarily weakens and there's enough moisture in place, that system could gradually take on tropical or subtropical characteristics. Now, these setups don't usually produce classic, well-organized hurricanes. Instead, they often lead to a broad, somewhat disorganized system that can still have significant impacts, especially when it comes to rainfall. So that brings us to storms like Tropical Storm Albert, which is a great example of how early storm systems behave. I'm going to pull up Albert just to give you an idea. Here it is here, Alberto, that is completely my fault there. So Alberto is the closest storm that has ever impacted us here along the Gulf Coast water. So like I said, for the location, I included Mobile County, and this is within 200 nautical miles of Mobile County. So as you can see, this is the closest storm that's ever impacted our area, and this was on May 25th of 2018 to May 31st of 2018. So Tropical Storm Alberto, which is a great example of how early season systems behave, this type of system often originates from a non-tropical feature like an old front or large area of disturbed weather in the Gulf. They tend to be expansive, sometimes lopsided, and not particularly strong in terms of wind, but what they lack in wind intensity, they often usually make up in rainfall and flooding potential. So those are usually the main factors that go into these systems if they make landfall, is more of the rainfall and flooding potential there. So with these kinds of systems, the impacts are rarely confined to the center. You can see heavy rain bands extending far away, sometimes affecting areas hundreds of miles from where the storm initially formed. That's especially important along the Gulf Coast, where even a weak system can produce several inches of rain in a short period of time. When we focus specifically on systems that have come within about 200 nautical miles of Mobile County during the month of May, the historical records show that these events are relatively rare, and when they do occur, they are typically not strong hurricanes. More often than not, they are weak tropical storms, subtropical systems, or even just areas of disturbed weather that enhance rainfall across the region. So for the Mobile area, the most common impact for a May system would include periods of heavy rain, gusty winds, rough surf, and elevated tides. So this is within 200 nautical miles. We're going to go even closer where we have 60 nautical miles. So as you can see, we don't have anything within that 60 nautical mile period, but that one that I just showed you, Tropical Storm Alberto, probably did bring rain to the region. So If anything, that could have been beneficial rain, that could have brought flooding. It really just depends on the situation and where we are at in our season. So severe, long-lasting wind damage like we associate with peak season hurricanes is extremely uncommon this early in the year. The bigger concern tends to be localized flooding, especially if the system is slow-moving or interacts with an existing frontal boundary. Another interesting point is that many of the systems that affect the central Gulf Coast in May don't travel long distances across the Atlantic. Instead, they tend to form relatively close to home, either in the Gulf itself or nearby in the Caribbean. That means there's often less lead time compared to storms that develop further out later on in the season. So all these really highlight the nature of May as a shoulder season. It sits right between the more active severe weather pattern of spring and the more stable tropical driven pattern of summer. Because of that, the atmosphere can behave in ways that are a bit unpredictable, but you can go most of the month with nothing at all and then suddenly have a brief window where something tries to develop. The bottom line is that while May tropical systems are not very common, they are certainly possible. They tend to be short-lived, somewhat disorganized, and heavily influenced by non-tropical features. But even so, they can still bring meaningful impacts, especially in terms of rainfall along the Gulf Coast. And from a preparedness standpoint, that's really the takeaway. Even though the odds are low, it only takes one system forming in the right place under the right conditions to bring impacts to the areas like Mobile. That's why meteorologists start paying close attention this time of year, watching for those subtle changes in the pattern that could briefly open the door for development. So while May may not be the heart of hurricane season, it's definitely the time when we start to see the atmosphere testing the waters, sometimes quite literally, as we ease into the months ahead. So this was a brief presentation to just give you an idea of things could happen if it all aligns correctly. It's very uncommon for everything to really align correctly in regards to the atmospheric ingredients. And another thing that goes into play is El Nino, La Nina, and a neutral pattern. In this case, we're expecting an El Nino pattern, which basically means that we could basically have a below average season. But again, it only takes one storm to make a season bad. So this is not me telling you nothing is going to form in the month of May. We're going to have a very quiet hurricane season. These are not things I'm saying. These are just things to put on your radar so you could always have that slight inkling to prepare. This is also right before hurricane season, so we have a month, which seems like a while, but it really isn't. This is the time when we need to start, as meteorologists, we need to start paying attention to the atmosphere and seeing how it's cooperating. But for now, we are not expecting anything tropical in the near future or really in the long term. But remember, the chances are never zero.